Welcome, everyone, to the Ignite Illuminator interview series. I am so delighted today to be joined by Sorcha McEwan. Welcome, Sorcha.
Hello.
We are going to share, well, I'm going to share a brief bio of Sorcha, and then she's going to talk a little bit about her most current project that she's working on. So, Sorcha McEwan is a cultural historian, writer, and lecturer. She has lectured in Canada and the UK on cultural mythology, comparative religion, the occult sciences, and the history of the goddess religions. She has taught courses on the Celtic traditions at the Findhorn community in Scotland and spent a summer as a guest lecturer in Wales speaking on the Arthurian legends and the Grail cycle. She is currently engaged in a writing project entitled The Books of Love, The Hidden Writings of Jesus and the Magdalene. Wow, Sorcha, everything that I just read, I am so fascinated by, and I'm sure our listeners would also love to hear a lot more about you and what you do, and especially your current project. Would you please share for us a little bit more about that and what prompted you to start writing these books?
What prompted me to start writing this book in particular, I think I have about five on the go at the moment, uh, was a piece of historical research that I came across. I was reading at one time both about, in depth, about the Crusades,
Hmm.
and of course, two of the very large groups that featured in the Crusades and in the Christian Crusades in general. First of all, were the Knights Templar,
Hmm.
and second of all, were a religious group out of France called the Cathars. Um, and what I discovered was that they both used writings that were not the Bible to underpin their religious practices. And
Mm.
I found that extremely interesting because they were both enormously intertangled with Catholicism, with Christianity as it existed at the time. So to find that out struck me as really interesting. And although they weren't contemporaneous, um, I just found that to be really interesting. And that led me down a speculative path as to what they actually were working from. Now, we don't have the copies of those writings any longer. They vanished either when the Inquisition took over or took on the Knights Templar, or when they eradicated the Cathars in France during the Albigensian Crusade.
Hmm.
But I was really interested about that. So I started to do a lot of deeper research, both into certainly into Jesus of Nazareth, because of course he really is the touchstone for it all.
Hmm.
And then as a result, and in association with that, inevitable association with that, Mary Magdalene. And I also at the same time noted generally that Mary Magdalene had become this enormously popular figure sort of all of a sudden.
Yeah, I've
And
noticed that
yeah,
too.
yeah. And I was like, well, that's really interesting because um, we know that she was, intrinsic to the Jesus story.
Hmm.
Um, of other than Paul, other than Peter and John, she is mentioned more than any other person in association with Jesus.
Hmm.
Um, and yet, um, she's mentioned 12 times. And then, of course, sometime thereafter, and it wasn't until about, I think, the 5th century, Gregory the First decided to tell the world that she was a prostitute by conflating her with the unnamed woman, which served his political agenda, but kind of, well, not kind of, decidedly condemned her in the eyes of universal Catholicism as a fallen woman for the rest of history.
Hmm.
Now, there's nothing in the Bible that says that. There's no biblical support for that idea. And actually, in 1969, the Vatican reversed that, saying that there was no reason to believe that. But it was very definitely a particularly convenient position to take if you wanted to represent women either as an inviolate virgin, i.e., the mother of Jesus, or a fallen woman. It was a perfect dualism for a fundamentally misogynistic religious base.
Mm-hmm.
paternal religious base, particularly a religious base that favored celibacy uh, over any kinds of sins of the flesh.
Mm-hmm.
So I began to suspect that Mary Magdalene was represented after the fact as kind of a stage prop for the main star, who was Jesus. But if you start to look at the histories, if you go back and start to really look at the writings of the historians and the people of importance in those days, the ones who gave us an awful lot of information about the early first, second century, third century Middle Eastern world, you find that is not exactly, that's not who she was at all.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly after the discovery at Nag Hammadi in 1945, when the Gnostic Gospels were were discovered. Um, there's multiple Gospels in that treasure trove that spoke of Mary Magdalene in a massively different way. Like they
Yeah.
spoke of her with great reverence. They spoke of her, Jesus himself, according to this, referred to her as the apostle to the apostles. Like it completely reconfigures their relationship.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, now, of course, some people would like to go so far, and I always like to say at some point, I'm a historian, right?
Yes.
So I stay to as clearly as I can to the evidence that we have versus speculative history. There's nothing wrong with speculative history, but it needs to be recognized as speculative history. Thank you, Dan Brown.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and even the Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which is what Dan Brown took the Da Vinci Code from, was profoundly speculative history.
Mm.
But if you take a look at the literal histories that we have, it comes to appear as though Mary Magdalene was a totally different character than she has been presented us to, as she's been presented to us to as through the four gospels of the New Testament.
Yeah. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about who she actually was based on your research. I'd love to hear that.
Well, I'd like to be clear about this. We don't know who she actually was. But
Okay.
what we do know is, because we know virtually nothing about her. I mean, because we only have the New Testament. And
Okay.
in the New Testament, she's really always spoken of simply as someone who was present in Jesus's life, who financed him. She was a woman of wealth, and he and the disciples, excuse me, were basically bankrolled by a group of wealthy women, which allowed him to fulfill his mission. She traveled with the disciples. She traveled with Jesus. We know that to be true.
Mm-hmm.
It is said that she came from a place, she was known as Mary Magdalene because it is said that she was from a place called Magdala, although there's historical reasons to believe that that is not actually accurate.
Mm-hmm.
It may have meant something else, her name. But again, all of that may have been written out of history, formulated around the way that the church wanted to present the story.
Ah.
Yeah. So if you take, I mean, there's certain schools of thought that believe that Jesus and Mary were actually married.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that goes a long way to the bloodline story that, evolves in the Da Vinci Code. But whether they were married or whether they weren't married, they were certainly incredibly close, deeply in relationship, and uh, and we're almost inseparable. And it must always be remembered that Mary Magdalene was the first one to see Jesus after his death.
Mm-hmm.
And later writers, St. Paul included, tried to write that out. He tried to say that it was Peter that saw Jesus first, but that is not the case.
Yeah. It really
So
spoke to those times, right?
yeah, so the more you look at it, the more you see that there are glaring discrepancies or just gaps, which may be part because which gaps which essentially were formulated to create a cohesive narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Who I think she was? Well, personally, I actually think that I think that it all comes down to that missing 18 years in Jesus's life.
Mm.
Many people will know, but the last the last time he's known after he is at 12 years of age before he comes back for his ministry 18 years later. He's up at the temple in Jerusalem and he's debating the rabbis,
Mm-hmm.
which is pretty unusual in and of itself. But he then disappears,
That's right.
and and the Bible says absolutely nothing about him after that until he reappears at 30 and goes to be baptized by John the Baptist.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a huge question around where he was for those 18 years.
Now, those Gnostic books that you were speaking of earlier, the Gospels, is there any reference in those books about the missing 18 years or more information about Mary Magdalene there?
Well, there's a huge amount of information about Mary Magdalene, right? About Magdalene, and not just information about Magdalene. I mean, not so much about who she was as a person, but about her position in relationship to Jesus. But they were absolutely seen as co-equals. Like there was no sense at all that there was him and then she was somehow an afterthought. She
Mm-hmm.
was held with an enormous reverence, and in fact was known as the apostle to the apostles
Mm-hmm.
and as named by Jesus himself.
Mm-hmm.
But more than the Gnostic Gospels themselves, and there's I think about 54 of them. Um, I personally believe that during those 18 years, and there are numbers of books. There's the Book of Enoch, and I certainly know that the Aquarian Bible and others that I can't name right offhand. There's certainly documentation in both Nepal and in Tibet and in India that Jesus was there. There's good reason to believe that he probably went to Egypt. I also happen to believe that he was in a scene. That's not a popular belief, but I believe he was. There's a lot of, I would say, historical evidence that would support that. It's arguable.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I personally think that at 12 years of age, he got shepherded away. And I personally think that he traveled to multiple countries to study with multiple masters.
Mm-hmm.
And I also happen to believe, there's no direct evidence of this whatsoever, but I also think there's very good evidence pointing to the fact that he may have met Mary Magdalene in Egypt, because a lot of the esoteric information that's that looks at them from a different lens, looks at the Mary and Jesus relationship from a different lens, indicates that they may have been initiates in the Isis Osiris mysteries. And if that's the case, then the whole story of his death and resurrection is a reenactment of the Isis Osiris myth.
Mm-hmm.
And that was that the Isis Osiris mysteries, amongst other places, were very strongly represented in Alexandria in Egypt. And
Mm-hmm.
I happen to think he went to Alexandria. And I also happen to think that that may be where he first met Mary Magdalene.
The name.
So whether or not they were married, whether or not they were sexually intimate, um, I personally see no reason. It's not known, but it's also not impossible
Mm-hmm.
that the nature of their relationship was an esoteric one, and that
Mm-hmm.
she was his equal in every manner, and that aspect of her as a priestess and as a great teacher. The Eastern Orthodox Church held her as a great teacher, so they held her in great reverence. Um, I think was written out of the canonical Gospels because it didn't suit the patriarchal narrative of the time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I've heard that from a variety of sources. So, one thing I'm super curious about, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Why do you think we are seeing such a, not a resurgence, but more of a surgence, I guess, of the Mary Magdalene um, enigma? Like, I'm seeing more and more things on social media. There's more courses available. There's more people wanting to speak about it. What do you think that's all about? What do you think's the underlying reasons this is happening now?
Well, that's the question I asked myself when I started to look into it. Was like, I mean, Mary Magdalene, yes, she is an individual of note,
Mm-hmm.
and yet in many ways, she, at least in my first sort of contemplations of it, was not more remarkable than other women throughout history, comparatively speaking.
Mm-hmm.
But the more I looked into it, the more I came to realize that in her own way, I think that she's highly emblematic of the place of cultural evolution that women are engaging with right now. And I think she's emblematic because I do think her story was much different than we are told. I
Hmm.
do think that she was that her reputation was hijacked by paternal disapproval.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, there was no history of her being a prostitute whatsoever. Just a slight anecdote. So I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and we were walking through Beacon Hill Park, and it was a very sunny day, and there was a family there having a picnic. The mother and the father, and it looked like the daughter and son-in-law. And I was talking to my friend, and I said, the worst of it, I said, is that even though the Vatican rescinded that accusation, which was never accurate, it was created in the 6th century by Gregory V. Um, I said, people still think she's a prostitute. And my friend
Hmm.
said, no, they don't. And I turned to this family. I had no idea who they were. I said, okay, everybody at this table, put up your hand. Who thinks Mary Magdalene was a prostitute? And they all put their hand up.
Oh my
It's,
goodness.
oh, yeah, people think that she was a prostitute. And she wasn't. And in fact, she was so much more than a prostitute. And I think that that is really reflective of she, to a degree, she's almost an icon of the historical female.
Hmm.
Because in the same way, there was a very between. I mean, Jesus died in 33 AD, and the four Gospels were taken on as the church canon at about 325 at the Council of Nicaea under the reign of Constantine, and that means that there was 300 years basically between Jesus's death and when the institution of the Christian church really began to grow. And in that 300 years, there's a lot of historical evidence, and this is clearly indicated, that what people thought about Mary Magdalene for that 300 years was nothing like what we were presented with as the heirs to the Council of Nicaea. So I think that she's emblematic of the history of women, that essentially that women held positions of power. We know that there were very influential women in the early church in those 300 years. There were women bishops. They performed the mass. They were ecclesiastical, marvelous thinkers, religious powerhouses, and yet we don't hear about them. You don't hear
Hmm.
about them. I mean, and the fact that women to this day are not allowed to be clergy in the Roman Catholic Church is based upon the belief, or at least on the foundation, that women weren't close to Jesus and featured not in any way, shape, or form in any meaningful way in terms of his mission. And so, therefore, Jesus himself deemed that women were inferior
Hmm.
and therefore could not be clergy. It's rot. It's
Yeah.
just complete rot. So I think Mary represents to a lot of women the refinding of self, sort of like the unearthing of the history of women of power and capacity and competence and vision that were literally written out of Western history.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you've nailed it. I've been talking to people about the rising of the divine feminine and what does that mean? And I'm seeing more and more groups popping up even on social media about empowering women and women in business and specifically around the idea of self-empowerment. And I think when I listened to another speaker who was talking about Mary Magdalene, she took it to a very esoteric level, and it didn't have the same frame of cultural relativity that you're bringing. And so it's interesting to me from sort of an intellectual perspective about why women are so drawn to that. And I think pardon me, in our generation, I was raised in a born again Christian household. The story of Mary Magdalene is just as you told it was all about her being a harlot, not a position in a position of power or having a status that Jesus had. And it was all of the Bible stories we heard were very patriarchal.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think women didn't grow up of my generation and previous generations with a lot of strong female role models. And so now what I'm seeing is women want to embrace that again and are looking to history to say, yes, women did have places of power. Women were respected. Women were revered. It's just more recent history that has discounted the power of women. And it's not about power like women over men, where it has typically been men over women. I'm hoping, being an Aquarian and future thinking, I'm hoping that within my lifetime I'll also see more of the marrying between the masculine and the feminine. So the
Well,
Jesus
your
Mary
language is
story.
wonderful. Your language is wonderful because if you want to take this out of the historical realm and take it into the esoteric realm, archetypally speaking, Mary and Jesus are seen as not certainly not the only, but certainly as an incarnation of the Hieros Gamos, which is the sacred marriage. And
Hmm.
that is in the most metaphysical way, that is the marriage of the two polarities of masculine and feminine, which you see, indicated very clearly if you take a look at the symbol of the I Ching,
Hmm.
right? The black dot within the white field and the white dot within the black field. And those that symbol, whether it's considered in symbolic language, or whether it's brought down to the manifold and the manifest earthly experience, uh, indicates a universal tension that is absolutely necessary uh, for creation to exist.
Hmm.
But what must be looked at there, I mean, is two things. The first of which is that they are absolutely co-equal and they cannot exist without the other.
Hmm.
So, I think that speaks to a couple of things going on in our culture today. The first of which is the realization that, well, a number of things, that not the least of which is that it is reasonable to assume that women throughout ancient history held positions of power and influence that were eventually discouraged and disrupted and legislated against. That was with the rise of the patriarchy, which probably started to emerge around 6 or 7,000 BC.
Hmm.
Right, so we're kind of looking at maybe 8,000 years of it, but we believe, and because it's in the best interest of patriarchy, we believe that that is how it has always been, and that is simply not true. That is simply not true. So I think first and foremost, Mary Magdalene, in her relationship with Jesus, brings forward woman as equal.
Hmm.
Um, but I also think that it's incredibly important that one of the real assets of her, as versus, say, for instance, Diana of Themyscira, or like Wonder Woman, or any of the, or even Captain Marvel. I mean, any of the solitary women heroes or models. Um, I think it's equally as important to recognize that you can't have the masculine without the feminine, and you cannot have the feminine without the masculine. So it's not just a question of co-equal. It's not just a question of equality. It's that they are dependent upon one another in all of their majesty, and in all of their beauty, and in all of their complementarity. That's the best word for it. They are complements of one another.
Hmm.
And particularly, I think in our society today, where there is at least currently a fair amount of animosity in many circles between the genders, um, I think it's really important that we don't vilify the other, because the other in this particular instance is the other half of creation.
Hmm.
And I think that calls to women as well. I think that, the idea that it's actually it's a partnership that is not just inherently balanced, but is inherently wonderful, is
Hmm.
inherently promising and inherently creative.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I've met a lot of single women and I've met a lot of women looking for a relationship, and I've been in relationship with the same man for 44 years. And
Mazel tov.
yeah, thank you. And I think part of that is always respecting the other. So when you talk about the complementarianism of the male and the female, I see it exactly the same, right? It's a
Mhm.
whole. One does not work without the other. And it's how we embrace that within inside of ourselves as well. And, we had the feminist movement in the 60s and 70s, and a lot of men got kind of jaded by that, thinking it was women saying they were better than men. And so I'm hoping in this day and age that we're seeing more and more of no, it's both having power, both having voice, both being respected, inside of ourselves as well as externally, as how people present themselves as male or female, which is a whole other topic that
A
we
whole
won't
other
go into
topic, yes. We can start
at this.
talking Carl Jung for hours.
But yeah, just the whole idea of Mary Magdalene and how little we know about her. I feel very embarrassed that it's something I know nothing about. So when I met you back in June and heard a little bit about what you did, I thought this is relevant to our times. And so just coming back to the idea, you said at one point you're writing 5 books. Are you writing them all on this?
No, no, no,
Are
no.
they all different
Yeah,
stories?
no. No, they're all quite different. They're all quite
Okay.
different. Three of them it's a trilogy called The Books Nobody Gave, and that's basically about my cancer journey.
Ah,
And it was where that came out. It was as I was waiting for my diagnosis, et cetera, et cetera. I was thinking, okay, well, if I'm facing mortality, what would I leave as a legacy for people? And I
ah,
realized that these were books nobody gave me, and I would like to write them for people. So
ah.
those are 3 books. Another one is just a great deal of rollicking good fun. It's called The Wife, and it's
Okay.
about a marriage of convenience,
Oh,
um, a very unusual marriage of convenience between a Canadian and American who's trying to immigrate from the United States for obvious reasons. And then there's this, but I am first and foremost a historian, and as I said, certainly, I mean, as you can tell from the bio that you gave about me, I do not come from a Christian background. I come from a much more sort of polymathic question than that. But long ago, when I first started to study the history of women,
hmm.
I was as a young historian, you know, um, and this was kind of back in the Bronze Age. I realized that there was this vast area of missing history.
Hmm.
As I understand it, I just read this last week. Less than 0.5% of Western literature is concerned with women.
Oh my gosh.
Less than
Point
0.5%.
five. Oh
Yeah, it's
my
not even
goodness.
5%. It's 0.5. So, take a look at that statistic. So if someone had a particular political, and of course, I'm of the opinion that organized religion has as much political strategy in it as religious. Um, if there is a religious agenda coupled with politics, and Constantine's decision to take on Christianity as Christianity is the official religion of the Roman Empire was a massively political decision.
Hmm.
Um, uh, then, if the political narrative indicates that individuals and people and stories um, can, should, and must be eliminated to make a specific, clear, and cohesive one story, then the 0.5%, I mean, because the printing press didn't even come around until, 13th century.
Hmm.
So, and until then, I mean, there was virtually, I mean, almost nobody could read. Just the very top, the 1% of the 1% of the
Elite.
1% could
Yeah.
read.
Yeah.
Um, if you wanted to rewrite a story, you told a basic, simple story and you just removed the characters that you didn't want involved. And if you wanted a society that was fundamentally underwritten with women's subservience and certainly implied, if not outright spoken, inferiority, you just wrote them out of history.
Hmm.
You just wrote them out. Because there was, I mean, the Gnostic Gospels is a perfect example. The Gnostics were incredibly influential in first, second, and third history centuries, incredibly influential. But they believed, and this also comes into my novel, but they believed firmly that God is within.
Hmm.
God is not without. It's not some guy sitting on a throne up somewhere up the other side of Alpha Centauri, right? That God is within, and that we are responsible. We are divine beings who have forgotten who we are. And
Hmm.
so it is our responsibility to basically rediscover our own divinity. Now, problematically, that means you don't need a priest, you don't need a church, you don't need a temple, you don't need any of that. And that's what got the Cathars into so much trouble. So once Christianity became the predominant the religion of the Roman Empire, and then proceeded to essentially decide that anything that didn't agree with their own particular narrative would be written out of history or intentionally destroyed, which it was. Virtually any piece of literature, any document, any kind of hard copy of anything that involved Gnosticism was intentionally destroyed because
Mhm.
that was considered to be a heresy that the nascent Christian church was not willing to deal with because it took all the powers out of the church and the priest's hands and gave it to the individual people. And that's what got the Cathars destroyed in the Albigensian Crusade.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, as you were speaking about that, I was thinking about all the women who've been burned and killed and drowned through the witch hunt, and how that's now still a wound I think women carry genetically, where we've been almost fearful for our lives to embrace our power, to speak up, and to have a voice that says, yes, my opinions, my thoughts are of equal value. And I think that's also what is really drawing people into embracing the rising of the divine feminine. And to hear more about Mary Magdalene and who she really was to me is a testament for women to see that, yes, centuries ago, and in many cultures and in many countries, women did hold this place of power. And even though the patriarchy did try and abolish that, you can't eliminate it. It's still there. It's still in our history, but people have to dig, like people like you who have taken the time to actually explore this. Thank you. Thank
No,
you
that's
so
all right.
much.
But your point is well taken. I mean, I seriously, and I'm just telling you this, I've probably read 35 books on this subject. You know, because I've looked at it from every position I can. I've looked at it from the position of Rome. I've looked at it from the position of the records of the Greco-Roman world, the Hellenized world. I had to take a look at the history of, of the entire Mediterranean. If you're going to look, you're going to have to look deep,
Mm.
but the information is there.
Hmm.
But as for women's power, I mean, the problem I think first of all was, it could be argued, and I think is that there is something spooky about women's power. Now, women don't find women's power spooky, but men find women's power spooky. And so, because of that, particularly if you are in a system that is systematically dedicated and built upon domination and violence, which is what the war economies are,
Hmm.
um, it's necessary. Everything is about who has more power, and the evident, dualism of the male versus the female, then shoehorned into a good and evil universe means that whoever is good is determining whatever is evil, and that's where women's power was relegated into, because I don't think men really understand what women's power is. For that matter, I don't think a lot of women understand what women's power is because we've never actually seen it. Do you know what I
Hmm.
mean? I mean, it's all like all very well and good to point out, well, we have like, we have, for instance, like Indira Gandhi, or we had, you know, Margaret Thatcher, but they were to a degree are anomalies. They are anomalies in what is essentially still a patriarchal world.
Hmm.
If somebody asked me right off the bat who I thought was probably one of the most powerful women in the world today, I'd say Greta Thunberg.
Hmm.
And that lassie, I'm sorry, I can't remember her name, Milan, that girl that the Taliban shot.
Hmm.
Yeah, they tried to kill her because she was going to school, right? And she survived and went out. Malala, that's her name.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where you're going to find the source of what women's power actually is. And I think we're just coming into, well, pray goddess, we're coming into a time when women can actually begin to investigate what that looks like, and they will find it through looking at the stories of women like Mary Magdalene.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I'm just almost speechless to think where we were and where we are today. And it's almost like we have to go back in time to reclaim who we are today. It's like there's this void in between called the patriarchy that, as I was saying, tried to abolish so much of our history and rewriting the Bible and pulling out, books that were once part of the whole. I feel robbed,
Well, you
right?
should. I
Yeah.
mean, you should. I mean, the women's anger about the patriarchy. Now, in their defense, millions upon millions of men have been victims of the patriarchy as well. Like we always forget that when we talk about the patriarchy, we have a tendency to think that it's sort of all men are in that boat and we're in the other boat.
Yeah.
The patriarchy has only ever served 1% of 1%, and that's the top 1% of men.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to see the result of what patriarchy has done to men, just go to any military graveyard on the face of the earth. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the war machine basically grinds everything up, and it just uses willing bodies, whatever they may happen to represent. So, I always like to try and bring a certain kind of balance into that. I mean, those men have also been robbed of a great deal.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're but in the light of that, nevertheless, women have undoubtedly they have been robbed from their place in history
Yeah.
and punished
Mm-hmm.
if they had the audacity to try and step outside of it. Take a look at Hypatia.
Mm-hmm.
She was a mathematician, she was an orator, she was a lecturer, she was probably one of the greatest minds in Alexandria. And she was, well, quite frankly, she was torn apart by a mob of Christians. But she was one of the greatest minds in the Greco-Roman world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but she had the audacity of not adhering to social norms. So there's a legitimacy to feeling robbed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but at this point in history, when we're facing what we're facing in terms of climate change and in terms of the rising of authoritarian governments and in terms of contending empires and paradigm shifts. My suggestion to people is that I only hope that women are wise enough to be able to step aside from, or at least not embody that anger and work towards a more constructive future. Because I think at this point we don't have another 10,000 years to work this out. Like we
Mm-hmm.
worked out that we did patriarchy for 8,000, 9,000 years, and frankly, it hasn't worked, and it hasn't worked well at all for anybody. We
Mm-hmm.
got that, but we don't have another 9,000 years facing what we're facing now. And so I hope that women are able to, with the right education, and I'm like to believe I'm an educator in that department, is to find their power in cooperation and to find their power in what needs to be done as versus what needs to be paid back, some form of payback.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're speaking my language.
Oh,
Having been a leader in all my adult life in the different careers that I've chosen, it's always been about collaboration. How can
mhm.
we work together where both parties win versus the win-lose, right? That has been our concept for way too long. And
Well, and again, it was also a tool of the patriarchy because, I'm a great defender, and people kind of look at me like, "What are you talking about?" I'm a great defender of Charles Darwin. Now,
Mhm.
Charles Darwin's work got hijacked. Charles Darwin's work demonstrated that yes, there was competition in nature, but he actually said in his actual writings that in as much as there was competition, there was actually every bit, if not more, cooperation between the species.
Mhm.
What we're learning now about mycelium, what we're learning now about how forests nurture each other, what we're learning about bees and the octopi and et cetera, et cetera. But because of the time that he was writing in the heartland of the British Empire.
Mhm.
And so it served their narrative to underline and emphasize survival of the fittest because that greatly built the reasons and the justifications and the rationalization of white supremacy.
Mhm.
But Darwin didn't say it's the survival of the fittest. He actually didn't say that.
Mhm.
But we were told that he did,
Yeah.
and we bought it. And that is basically the bottom line of capitalism.
Hmm.
But there are other and better models.
Yeah.
And if you look for them, you can find them.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm seeing more and more young people actually stepping up into roles of leadership. When I say younger, like people in their 20s, 30s, who are showing us a new way of doing things. And it's not, I think of the communes and the hippie movement, like they had a flavor of it, and it got kiboshed because then they were all labeled as, potheads and drug addicts and this, that, and the other. But I think there was a germ of truth in what they were trying to bring to the forefront. And some of that was in contrast to what was happening, like the Vietnam War and the assassinations and the red tape with Nixon and all of that. But I think now, when I speak to young people and listen to them, they're not doing drugs. They're not drinking. They are eating well. There's this whole movement of people that are very much at the forefront of let's find a new way of doing life. And I give them my full support. And I agree with you. Education is key. If people don't know, if they don't explore, if they don't learn, then we're just sitting with our own belief systems, right? And those just regurgitate.
Indeed, and that as well is intentional. I mean, I'm sounding like I'm a raging anti-capitalist, but
No.
but that also, I mean, if you want to take a look at it, schools were originally designed. Schools were not designed for the working class for them to get educated. Schools were designed, particularly under the British system, essentially to police the children of industrial workers who were running rampant in the streets.
Hmm.
So basically, they were thrown into schools as a disciplinary action, and possibly they might come out with enough numbers and enough letters to be good little obedient factory workers. But there
Hmm.
was never any intention for education. There was never any intention for the expansion of the mind because capitalism does not want expanded minds. You can't frighten people who have some form of education.
Yeah.
They're just a whole lot less easy to manipulate.
Hmm.
So even the concept, I mean, and the British concept, the education as we know it in terms of a structural model emerged from the writings of Loyola, who was a Jesuit priest. I mean, go figure,
Hmm.
right? So um, education is absolutely key. But the other thing is you got to make education interesting.
Hmm.
Like you got, I mean, one of the reasons why I'm a cultural historian is because there's very little few things on the earth that I find more entertaining than history. I mean, it's a treasure house of the most incredibly interesting stuff.
Yeah.
And if you've got teachers that are impassioned about it,
Hmm.
as I was lucky to have,
Yeah.
um, then you get impassioned about it. And in that passion, you think laterally, you think better, you think more creatively, and you begin to start looking into the stories behind the stories.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know this is sort of off topic, but it is another thing of interest to me, the whole Charlie Kirk thing that's been going on, and the fact that he was killed and he was on campuses telling the college students that they were wasting their time. And I thought, I was not a big proponent of school. When I was in school, I felt just like you described. Like it was a jail. It was a place where it was not about freedom of thought. I loved to ask a lot of questions. I probably drove the teachers mad when they had 30 or 40 kids in their classroom. But education to me is not necessarily just about schools, it's about self-education. And when people find a subject matter that they're interested, if they can do what you've done and read 30 books. Like I love books. I'm always reading and always adding to my knowledge base. But the subject matter of Mary Magdalene, the reason I wanted to bring you onto this series is because of what we're seeing in society today and women getting more interested. Now, is there anything else you want to share with our listeners today about things that you're working on or things you have coming up?
Well, the book is primary. I actually, like yourself, am attempting to create at least a part-time career as a public speaker.
Mm-hmm.
Um, my background, cultural history has always been my passion, but it's rarely been my day job.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I've got yonks of years in the hospitality industry, in the service industry in general. Um, and I would really, I love educating people.
Hmm.
So I'm engaged right now in a series of lectures that I'm giving on Salt Spring Island. I'm hoping to bring those to Victoria. And but I also have the capacity to speak not just on cultural history or mythology, which is my heart realm, but I also talk a lot about, I can talk about business administration, my master's degrees in leadership and business, and but really what it comes down to, and the reason that this ties together, is because I'm a cultural historian, and what that means is that I study cultures,
Hmm.
and of course, as you well know, everything's a culture.
Hmm.
Businesses are cultures, families are cultures, post offices are cultures. Everything that humans engage themselves in are essentially cultures. So what I do is I basically I sort of unpack cultures and then rebuild them. And so at the moment that is the most specifically directed at first century Palestine,
Hmm.
but I also am also looking to do some work in terms of cultural analysis across a broad spectrum of human society.
Wow.
Yeah, because I think in as much as each of them is absolutely unique, they all have common elements, and of course
Hmm.
the common element is the humans that people them,
Hmm.
and I'm somewhat interested in people.
A little bit of an understatement, no.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
now, if people want to get in touch with you and explore doing some work together, what is the best way for them to reach you? Is it via email? Do you have a website?
I'm working on a website currently.
Okay.
Email is fine.
And your email is?
Okay. SWMCEWAN at shaw.ca.
Great. We'll put that in the comments as
Okay.
well.
Yeah.
Well, Sorsha, this has been a fabulous conversation. I can't believe how quickly the time has gone. We're just coming up on 2:30. Is there anything else you would like to say in closing? Oh dear. I think Sorsha has signed off. So we will say thank you very much. And if you have any questions for Sorsha, you can reach her at the email, and I will put it in the comment section as well.